Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So continuing, this is module 6, and we're going to be talking about the stages of insight. And these, we want to look at the version which is described by an American meditator who has many high claims and is quite controversial, and his name is Daniel Ingram. You can find work by him on the internet. I like his way, personally. I can't verify all of his claims, but I like his way of talking very, very directly, and very, very much from the basis of meditators' experience, instead of too much to the textbooks, and also because he's talking directly about how meditation can be used to attain directly what it's meant to attain. So let's have a look at some of his texts. There's plenty of it, so I'm going to read it through. It's going to be a reading block, more of this one. So please pay attention. I wouldn't be doing it unless I thought this text was very important to read. It's important information, and it's not easy to find. It's in amongst a 350-word document, one chapter, so I think it's very important. The arising and passing away. The arising and passing away goes by many names, including deep insight, knowledge of the arising and passing of phenomena. The second, Vipassana jhana. The fourth, jnana. Pseudo-nirvana, the wave, kundalini awakening, and many others. Some simply refer to it as the A and P, see also arising and passing away. It is one of the most significant events in spiritual practice, as it sets those who have crossed it on what might be termed a spiritual journey, whether they want to be or not. It leads inevitably to a phase of spiritual territory that may be called many things, including the knowledges of suffering, the dukkha jnanas, the dark night of the soul, the third Vipassana jhana, or for many here simply the dark night. The A and P can manifest in a whole host of different ways, such that two people describing these events to each other might never guess that fundamentally they had gone through the same basic territory. It can happen to people with no formal meditation training, and sometimes in very surprising circumstances. Some may cross it very early in life, while others may never cross it at all, despite extensive attempts at practice and progress. Common characteristics of arising and passing territory or events include, but are not limited to, bliss and rapture, energetic phenomena, namely kundalini phenomena, spontaneous movements, strange breathing patterns, strong concentration, great posture in those who are meditating, strong lucid dreaming, and in fact this event may be crossed in dreams, which is nearly diagnostic of this stage. Seeing bright lights, particularly early dual-tone sparkles, leading to more steady white lights, though not everyone sees these. Strong sexual feelings, which may have a certain generic quality. The ability in those practicing to perceive fine vibratory phenomena rapidly and nearly effortlessly, perceive the impermanence of phenomena, and dissect objects into their rapidly arising and passing components, parts, hence the name. A strong sense of faith in the path, assuming one thought of oneself as on a path when they encountered this, a reduced need for sleep, increased energy and excitement about life, plans, projects, spiritual practice, philosophy, and potentially wild grandiosity. On that front, it is not uncommon for people who have simply crossed the arising and passing to believe themselves to now be enlightened, when in fact they are not yet there. This stage can look an awful lot like a manic episode in some people. If you are hunting around websites like this one, looking around for advice on retreats, the maps of meditation, how to make progress, etc., the chances are good that somewhere along the way you crossed the A and B. even if you didn't know what it was and don't really remember a time or event that contained the above elements. Now we're going to go into the chapter of the book, the Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, written by Daniel Ingram, starting from chapter 24, The Progress of Insight. So this starts systematically from the beginning. So the stage we just read about there is actually stage 4. But now he gives an overall view of the path, and we'll go up to the beginning of the jnanas. But he gives a very good overall discussion about what on earth the jnanas are, and how do they relate, and what should we think about them, rather than just going in as a technical manual of lists. So chapter 24, The Progress of Insight. The progress of insight is a set of stages that diligent meditators pass through on the path of insight. Some of the content-based or psychological insights into ourselves can be interesting and helpful, but when I say insights, these stages are what I'm talking about. Just so that you have seen the whole list of the names of these stages, the formal names of stages of insight in order are this. 1. Mind and body, seeing their different things. 2. Cause and effect. 3. The 3 characteristics. So these 3 stages are the pre-Vipassana stages and can be called the first Vipassana jhana. 4. The arising and passing away. 5. Dissolution. 6. Fear. 7. Misery. 8. Disgust or dispassion, it's also called. 9. Desire for deliverance. 10. Re-observation. So up to that point, these are the dark night dukkha jnanas that he's talking about. These difficult stages of meditation. Dark because they're very... we'll describe them as we go through. So those are the 3rd Vipassana jhana. 11. Equanimity, which is the 4th Vipassana jhana and equivalent to the 4th regular jhana. 12, and these ones, 12, 13, 14, 15, and to an extent 16, all happen very rapidly, very, very close together, moment, like that. So that is 12, conformity, 13, change of lineage, 14, path, 15, fruition, and then 16, review, and 15, fruition, means nirvana, one of 2 meanings. I'll give detailed descriptions of them shortly. I will refer to these stages by their shorthand titles, their numbers, and occasionally shorthand slang. These are formally known as knowledge of, and then the stage. For example, knowledge of mind and body. But I will just use the part after the of. So they are also called jnanas, which means knowledges, usually with a number, as in the 1st jnana, 2nd jnana, 3rd jnana. Notice that I use the word stage rather than state. These are stages of heightened perception into the truth of things. Opportunities to see directly how things actually are. But they are not seeming stable states, as with concentration practice. The jhanaic groupings refer to Vipassana jhanas, which will be covered in more depth later, but they borrow their perspectives and certain fundamental aspects from their samatha jhana equivalents. In other words, they may diverge widely from the experience of pure samatha jhanas. One of the most profound things about these stages is that they are strangely predictable, regardless of the practitioner or the insight tradition. Texts 2,000 years old describe the stages just the way people go through them today, though there will be some individual variation on some of the particulars today as then. The Christian maps, the Sufi maps, the Buddhist maps of the Tibetans and the Theravada, and the maps of the Kabbalists and the Hindus are all remarkably consistent in their fundamentals. I chanced into these classic experiences before I had any training in meditation, and I have met a large number of people who have done likewise. These maps, Buddhist or otherwise, are talking about something inherent in how our minds progress in fundamental wisdom that has little to do with any tradition and lots to do with the mysteries of the human mind and body. These stages are not Buddhist but universal, and Buddhism is merely one of the traditions that describes them, albeit unusually well. The progress of insight is discussed in a number of good books, such as Jack Kornfield's A Path with Heart, in the section called Dissolving the Self, which I highly recommend. A very extensive, thorough, accessible and highly recommended treatment of it is given in Mahasi Sayadaw's works, The Progress of Insight and Practical Insight Meditation, on BPS, out of Sri Lanka, Buddhist Publishing Society, a partially castrated version of which appears in Jack Kornfield's Living Dharma. It should be noted here that Practical Insight Meditation is my favourite Dharma book of all time, with no close competitors. If you can ever lay your hands on a copy, do so. Even the section of it that appears in Living Dharma is much better than having no access to none of it at all. Sayadaw U Pandita's In This Very Life also covers this territory and is a bit of a must-have for those who like lists and straight-up Theravada, but he leaves out a lot of juicy details. The Visuddhimagga, The Path of Purification, a 5th century text by Buddhaghosa, also does a nice treatment of these stages and contains some interesting and hard-to-find information. It focuses largely on the emotional side effects and thus misses many useful points. Another good but brief map appears in Venerable Khenpo Kata Rinpoche's Dharma Paths. You could also check out Bhante Gunaratana's The Path of Serenity and Insight if you would like to know the dogma well. It is a thorough and scholarly work. Matthew Flickstein's Swallowing the River Ganges is a light treatment of basic Buddhist concepts and contains a very superficial treatment of the stages of insight. It is kind of like what would happen if you condensed a medical school textbook down to a 5th grade science text. It focuses almost entirely on the emotional side effects and thus misses a huge amount that is worthy of discussion, but it comes from a good place and is harmless enough. It doesn't add anything to the above sources, but is easy to read. There are many less accessible maps of insight as well. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, Liberation Through Hearing in the Bardo, requires some prior familiarity with this territory to sort out the wild symbolic imagery. A 12th century Sufi map is given in Journey to the Lord of Power by Ibn Arabi, but again the medieval symbolism is somewhat hard to untangle unless you are already personally familiar with these stages. It also provides a very interesting, if quite cryptic, description of the higher stages of realization. St. John of the Cross, the Dark Night of the Soul, does a good job of dealing with the most difficult of the insight stages. His map is called The Ladder of Love. Unfortunately, the translation of the medieval Spanish and thickness of complex Catholic dogma make it fairly inaccessible. I strongly recommend that you consult some of these other sources, particularly the first 5 mentioned. While I consider the treatment of the stages of insight that follows shortly to be by far the most comprehensive and practical explanation of the stages of insight ever written, and I mean that honestly, so if you've got humility then flaunt it, basically. Left out, there is a huge amount of valuable information left out in all of these sources, perhaps due to the mushroom factor, but perhaps due to some of the difficulties in describing all the little nuances of the subject in all its possible variations. Thus, working with a teacher who has personal mastery of these stages, regardless of what they call them, is an extremely good idea most of the time. The model terminology I am using is from the ancient commentaries of the Pali Canon of the Theravada tradition. That means the Visuddhimagga, Vimuttimagga. Model is used mostly in Burma, but is also used to some degree in the other Theravada traditions. Zen is quite aware of these stages, as all Zen masters had to go through them and continue to do so. But they tend not to name them or talk about them, as is their typical style. This can be helpful, as people can get all obsessed with these maps, turning them into a new form of useless thought content and a source of imprisoning identification and competition. This is the ugly side of goal-oriented or map-based practice, but it often, though not always, may be overcome with honest awareness of this fact. Luckily, if the meditator really is into insight territory, continued correct practice has a way of unsticking them given time. Also, when the proverbial stuff is hitting the fan, having a map around can really help the meditator not make too many of the common and tempting mistakes of that stage, as well as provide the meditator with faith that they are on the right track when they hit the hard or weird stages. These stages can significantly colour or skew a meditator's view of their life until they master them, and it can be very helpful to remember this when trying to navigate this territory and keep one's job and relationships functioning. Those who do not have the benefit of the maps in these situations, or who choose to ignore them, are much more easily blindsided by the psychological extremes and challenges which may sometimes accompany stages such as the arising and passing away, and those of the dark night. While many people don't want to know the maps for various reasons, such as their own unexamined insecurities, I suspect that many more people could get a lot farther in their practice if they did know them. At the very least, the maps clearly demonstrate that there is vastly more to all this than just philosophy or psychology. They also clearly and unambiguously point to how the game is played step by step and stage by stage, what one is looking for, and more importantly, why, and give guidelines for how to avoid screwing up along the way. Why people wouldn't want to know these things is completely beyond me. They fill in the juicy details of the seemingly vast gap from doing some seemingly boring and simple practice to getting enlightened. Further, providing all of this extremely precise information on exactly what to do puts the responsibility for progress, or a lack thereof, clearly on the meditator, i.e. you, which is exactly where it should be. If after reading this book you don't put this extremely powerful information into practice, the fault is your own. There is considerable evidence that the lack of this information in insight traditions that don't use the maps has been one of the primary obstacles to progress. On the other hand, the maps can sometimes cause furious competition and arrogance in the traditions that do use them, as well as harmful fixation on purely future-oriented goals. Please do your very best to avoid these sorts of problems. The more intense, consistent and precise the practice, the easier it is to see how the maps apply. The more energy, focus and consistency is put into practice, the more dramatic and even outrageous these stages can be. If these stages unfold over long periods of time and gently, it can be more difficult to see the progression through them, though it does happen regardless. Certain emphases in practice, such as Mahasi Sayadaw style noting practice, awareness of seeing, awareness of hearing, particularly on intensive retreats, seem to produce a clearer appreciation of the maps, and some individuals will have an easier time seeing how these maps apply than others will. Each stage is marked by very specific increases in our perceptual abilities. The basic areas we can improve in are clarity, precision, speed, consistency, inclusiveness, and acceptance. It is these improvements in our perceptual abilities that are the hallmarks of each stage and the gold standard by which they are defined and known. Each stage also tends to bring up mental and physical raptures. These are unusual manifestations. These are fairly predictable at each stage and sometimes very unique to each stage. They are secondary to the increase in perceptual thresholds of ways by which we may judge whether or not we are in a particular stage. Each stage also tends to bring up specific aspects of our emotional and psychological makeup. These are also strangely predictable, but these are not as reliable for determining which stage is occurring. They are suggestible, ordinary, and will show more variation from person to person. However, when used in conjunction with the changes in perceptual threshold and the raptures, they can help us get a clearer sense of which stage has been attained. Further, these stages occur in a very predictable order, and so looking for a pattern of stages leading one to the next can help us get a sense of what is going on. Thus, when reading my descriptions of these stages, pay attention to these separate aspects: the shift in perceptual threshold, the physical and mental raptures, the emotional and psychological tendencies, and the overall pattern of how that stage fits with the rest. So the meditator sits down or lies down, stands, etc., and begins to try to experience each and every sensation clearly as it is. When the meditator gains enough concentration to steady the mind on the object of meditation, something called access concentration, apana samadhi, they may enter the first jhana, now called the first Vipassana jhana, which is in some ways the same for both concentration practice and insight practice at the beginning. However, as they have been practicing insight meditation, they are not trying to solidify this state, but are trying to penetrate the three illusions by understanding the three characteristics. These are impermanence, suffering, and non-self. We'll go into details as we go through. They have been trying to sort out with mindfulness what is body and what is mind, and when each is and isn't there. They have been trying to be clear about the actual sensations that make up their world, just as they are. They have been trying to directly understand the three characteristics, moment to moment, in whatever sensations arise, be it in a restricted area of space, such as the area of the sensations of breathing, a moving area of space, body scanning practices, in the whole of their world, as is done in choiceless awareness practice, using some other technique or object, or just by being alive and paying attention. Thus, this first stage has a different quality to it from that of concentration practice, and they attain to direct and clear perception of the first knowledge of one mind and body.